Hey now, I'm Dan Barrett with Screen Watching, which as we all know is the best damn movie and TV show review and commentary podcast on this here internet. Debuting in Australian cinemas next week and VOD in the US is Hellboy the Crooked Man. This is the fourth Hellboy live action movie, but there are a couple of animated films too, along with some video games and of course, the comic book that launched it all. What I've got for you now is a chat with Brian Taylor. He's the director and co-writer of the new Hellboy movie. He was the writer-director of two classic Jason Statham films, that would be Crank and Crank 2 High Voltage, but he's also no stranger to works connected to comics. He was the writer of the Jonah Hex movie, he directed the Nicolas Cage Ghost Rider movie, and he was the writer-director on the TV show Happy, which is based on a series of Grant Morrison comics. Now, with this film, he's got a co-writing credit alongside Hellboy writer-artist Mike Mignola and Mignola's regular collaborator Christopher Golden. This is a movie that strives to be authentic to the experience of the comics, while produced on a budget that's far lower than the blockbuster Guillermo del Toro Hellboy films of the 2000s. I was really interested chatting to him about that relationship that the film has to the comics, but also how that's informed by the budget. Here's my chat with Brian.
Crooked man's waiting on you.
That's interesting. Oh, you didn't want me to squash?
No, squashing's good.
When I look at movies and TV shows, I'm never really seeing a singular artistic expression. I'm seeing a work that's in conversation with all that came before it. So Hellboy, the Crooked Man, it's clearly in conversation with the previous Hellboy movies and Mike Mignola's comic. And I wanted to get to all of that, but I was kind of interested in the other works that informed you for this movie. So when you watch the film, it opens with this amazing sort of title sequence, which spoke to me of a lot of sort of 70s horror, but I was wondering what were the sort of, I guess, maybe visual cues, but also maybe sort of thematically things that you wanted to work through.
Yeah, I mean, this is Mike Mignola's favorite Hellboy story. And so, it was one that he really wanted to see come to life. So I never really felt like I was in conversation with the previous Hellboy movies so much. I felt like I was in conversation with his comic book a lot and with his brain a lot. And also, those are that era of Hellboy, those are folk horror stories. They're not big, what became $100 million space operas. These are contained little folk horror stories. And so visually, in terms of tone, I was looking to, contained folk horror movies. I wanted it to feel like 60s and 70s UK, folk horror productions. That's where the title sequence came from.
Yeah. Visually, was that probably the only thing that you sort of drawing from, and the rest was really sort of comic inspiration, or were there other things that you brought to it that maybe weren't on the page from Mignola?
Well, you always bring, something. You're making every frame you make is a choice. There's always a million choices that go into it. But I will say that, knowing that this was, the origin was this particular comic book, and that it was Mike's favorite book. I thought, look, we don't have $100 million. The best way to approach this thing is to have an audience of one. And that one is Mike. I want Mike Mignola to love it. I want him to feel like this is his character. Because I think if he loves it and he feels like we got it right, if he feels like we did the real authentic version, the creator's authentic version, if he loves it, then I feel that true fans will also love it. And so I just kept going back to his book for reference, and make sure that tonally we were in that landscape. And I didn't really want to. Look, I have a lot of respect for original creators. It's one thing if it's I've done films where it's all my writing, it's my characters, it's my IP, if you want to call it that. But when I'm working on something like this, I have a lot of respect for the guy who created the book. I mean, to me, it's like it's 100,000 times harder to invent something than to refine it. So I really want to take the approach on this of being really kind of almost reverential, toward Mignola. And that kind of always gave us a compass.
So look, there's no escaping that this is the fourth Hellboy film in the last 20 years, so audiences are obviously going to make their comparisons. But where the film's got a different narrative is obviously in regards to two things. So you've got the budget, and then you've got that creative engagement of Mike Mignola in the film. Now, Mignola, whose work is very much based in gothic mood, he's not really an artist who I think is especially interested in huge spectacle on the page, let alone on the screen. So does his involvement help you get to an authenticity that can actually be achieved on that smaller budget?
I thought so. Yeah, I mean, there were a few things that we scaled up a bit. It, you know, a lot of what I did is actually try to bring it closer to his comic book than actually what he had done, because the first draft that I saw of this was one that he had written with Chris Golden, and funny enough, I reading it, I felt that they had made changes to the original material in a way that they thought Hollywood would want. They sort of compromised it because they thought like, oh, well, they won't let us do that in a movie, or it really needs to be more like this, I guess. Just, for one thing, they made it contemporary. The draft I read it had cell phones in it. So when I came on, I told Mike, it's like, I really want to change all of this, but you're going to love it because I'm changing it back to what you originally had. And so, I was able to throw out a lot of the new stuff that was sort of less Hellboyish to me and get it back to sort of the real Hellboy.
Yeah, so look, the film obviously is incredibly lower in budget than the Del Toro films of 20 years ago. My feeling is that Hellboy works best at a smaller scale where it's more about the mood and vibe than the spectacle. And I was wondering, was that sort of part of your pitch when you were getting involved in it, that you really wanted to bring it down to that smaller scale?
It was always going to be that, so, but to me, the appeal for me was this was Mike's favorite story. I knew the books, and the books call for a certain scale, so, if you're adapting The Crooked Man, you're not trying to turn it into a space opera in the third act. You're trying to keep it in that world. So it was really more of a question of just like, let's embrace what this is and not try to, I don't think it has anything other than the title character. I just don't think it has anything to do with any of the other films. It just feels like a completely different universe to me.
So look, I mean, in terms of thinking about it as being sort of quite distinct to the other movies, I got to think about the idea of this film, considering the sort of price point of it, as well as just the sort of stories that you're telling, and the fact that Hellboy is of comics and the Mignola stories are serialized to a certain degree, while, each sort of arc sort of stands on its own as an individual story. That actually fits really well with the idea of these being not so much a singular sort of one-off movie, as much as, like, I keep on thinking about those sort of direct-to-video productions that you started seeing of some sort of franchise characters over the years, and this kind of feels of that. And I was wondering, sort of from a creative standpoint, was that a conversation that you were involved in where this could be more than just this one outing, and how did that maybe inform the production in terms of, maybe sort of casting and other elements that sort of come into play?
I don't think it informed the production. I mean, it's sort of like it's a given these days that literally anything that you do is expected to have the potential to be a franchise. It's just sort of a given. We don't make films anymore. I'm not sure if you know this. We don't make films anymore. We make content. Content is what we're making now. And guys like me and other directors, we're constantly, striving to not make content, but actually make films. So clearly you can see in this version of Hellboy, I think Kesey is just an amazing Hellboy, a younger version of the character. And clearly you can see in here that, like, yeah, of course, we could just start knocking off all of the great Mignola stories. He's since this is 1959. Wouldn't we want to see Hellboy in the 60s? Wouldn't we want to see him in the 70s? And it's all driven by music and vibe and tone and everything. And there's absolutely a roadmap forward to taking this character sort of down through the eras. That would be fantastic. But my feeling is, let's see if it works. See if people like this one. I think it's always really, really cringy to sort of telegraph to everybody, like, this is a new franchise. You are going to want to see more and more and more of this. I'm going to let the audience decide. If they want more, then sure, there's a roadmap to that.
Yeah, no, I was really interested in the roadmap for it. Like, there's obviously, I think, a lot of potential for future endeavors, and maybe not necessarily with the same creative team, but, certainly, not to dismiss you on there at all, but it sort of seemed as though the template had kind of been laid for lots of people to be able to pick up their Hellboy story and be able to tell it in different eras, different sort of takes on the style going forward.
I think in particular, like Kesey is a really compelling Hellboy. I mean, I think he's just the right guy.
Yeah. Well, okay, on that. So it's difficult to think about. I mean, for me coming into this initially, I was difficult to think about anyone other than Ron Perlman in a role. He's got such an oversized, big, charming, brutish presence that he brought to those first two films. You got David Harbour in the third film, who's got his own sort of sense of swagger. And I was wondering, when it actually came to casting your Hellboy, how did Jack Kesey meet that, and what were you looking for elementally from him?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, Ron Perlman is a real hero to all of us, I think, not just as an actor, but as a person.
Mm.
I'm a big fan of what he did. But, you know, with this one, we had a certain, we had a little bit of runway in that it's a younger version of the character. So if we go back to 1959, now we're looking at sort of an angry young man who's trying to find his place in the world. And we all have a little difficulty finding our place in the world, and we don't walk around with a red tail and like, you know, horns. So it's even harder for him. So what you're looking for is a guy who's young, but he feels like he's really lived, and he feels like he has some gravity and weight as a person. And Jack Kesey really had that. I mean, the first time I met him, I was like, man, this guy has that Hellboy thing where there's a lot of wisecracking and sarcasm and humor and everything, but you can tell he's really lived a life, and you can tell there's something going on under there. You know, he carries some pain around. He's like a real person. And so that's what I was looking for above all. You know, I think like the sarcasm and the wisecracking, I think there's a lot of guys who can do that. But it's just sort of a one-dimensional picture of who this guy is. If you really want Hellboy, you've got to see all that weight that he's carrying around under the surface.
Yeah. From a production standpoint, there's obviously a danger when you are working at this lower sort of end of the budget that a film can start to resemble a fan production, especially something as sort of lavish as this, with a titular character who is so heavily in makeup and costumes and so I get silly looking when translated out of the page. So how do you actually make it feel like it's an authentic film rather than maybe a fan production, which is, I guess, maybe sort of less authentic in tone?
Well, I mean, as filmmakers, we strive to we strive to do better than fan productions. That's a pretty big answer, you know, to that question. I mean, we in every day and in every way, you know, you try to elevate this stuff. Yeah, if you walked into the room and saw Kesey in the makeup with the costume in a brightly lit makeup room, you know,
Mm.
definitely there's a feeling of panic, like, oh my God, this is going to look ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
look at him. He's red. I mean, this is totally nuts. This is not good. And so that's when, you know, that's when this thing called filmmaking comes in, you know, like, because the first thing we saw was like, okay, that's, that's good, because what this really needs is a lot of black ink on that screen. You know, it's all about what you don't see, you know, and it's like, this is a character that needs to be lit with a lot of shadow. You know, it wants a lot of contrast. It wants a lot of noir. It wants things to be out of focus. It wants to be framed really carefully. You know, we want to push him into the dark and into the shadows as much as we can. Those daytime scenes are always the biggest challenge. And anything where I see that goddamn tail is a challenge. So it's like, that's where we go in and we really try to carefully make every frame work. And we did have this great Richard Corbin artwork from the original book that, you know, inspires that black ink on the frame, and a lot of shadow and a lot of contrast. And that was the direction we like to push it. You know, Jack's a smoker, which was awesome, because so is Hellboy, and he wanted to know if he could smoke in this movie because he hasn't been able to smoke in a lot of other movies. And I said, not only can you smoke, but I actually insist that you smoke constantly throughout the movie, because that smoke helps us, you know. Everything we can do to kind of like give us a little bit more texture and a little bit more contrast and a little bit more mood, and kind of take the, as you put it correctly, I think take the silliness off of what a guy in a red mask looks like, and make him sit more naturally in that world. You got to use every trick in the book to get there. I mean, I think I was really happy with the way it ended up. I mean, I think I can, you know, when I look at the movie, I don't flinch when I see him. I actually think he looks great. And when I get in, you know, I got in so close with the camera that the makeup people were scared. They said, like, oh my, do you have to shoot him that close? And I'm like, yeah, I think he looks great up close. let's just push the camera way into that face and light it correctly and really see the expression and the feeling on that guy's face.
Yeah, no, I think he did a great job in terms of removing that sort of silly aspect to it, because there's just such a fine line where I think it's quite easy to tip in the other direction. But you actually hit upon my final question. Sorry.
You are not wrong at all. It is a challenge.
Yeah. You hit upon my final question just a moment ago, the smoking. There is so much smoking in this movie, and I was thinking about the character of Wolverine, who's probably one of comicdom's most prolific smokers. Marvel's curbed him smoking cigars, I think, in the comics, and certainly not on the big budget movies and TV shows. Was this even a conversation for you guys in terms of can Hellboy smoke or not? I'd imagine being this sort of smaller production where you really are able to cater things a bit more towards a sort of fan servicing Mike Mignola sort of level, you can probably lean into it a bit more, but was it a chatter?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the first questions I asked is to the studio is how do you guys feel about Hellboy smoking? And they said, oh, that's fine. People can smoke in our movies. But, great, done. He's going to be smoking nonstop. Like wall to wall. Because let's face it, smoking looks cool. It just looks, I know it's bad for you. I know kids shouldn't smoke. I know. But it looks cool. It just looks cool. It always does and it always will. So I was very happy to have Hellboy being Hellboy in that way as early and often as possible. I think probably a good 8% of our budget was on cigarettes.
Well, you got to make sure that they're good cigarettes.
And it was, by the way, here's a tidbit too. None of that smoke in the Hellboy movie is movie smoke. That's all real tobacco.
I don't know why that's not on the poster. Brian, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.